Okay, I think we'll get going with our next session. This is on healthcare data, databases of my specific talk, but we have some distinguished panelists here who will introduce themselves as we get started. My name is Bill Feaster. I'm the Chief Medical Information Officer at CHOC Children's Hospital. And one of my primary responsibilities there is sort of having oversight over our electronic medical records. So I'm going to start the discussion out with a fairly traditional discussion of what an electronic medical record database looks like and how it's evolved over time. So I've been doing this for quite a while, and I was instrumental in putting a Meditech system into Children's Hospital Oakland back in 1984. And at that time, we were really looking to an EMR to do localization services like admission, discharge, transfer, and pretty much result reporting from the lab. That's what clinicians were really got from the EMRs. They were pretty simple systems. Now that has evolved over time. So in the 1990s, we had all kinds of new functionality. And these ended up being so-called best-of-breed systems, since no single vendor really had the capacity at that time to do a lab and a radiology and a surgery, et cetera. So we put all these systems together, knitted them together over time. And so what we ended up with was kind of a interfaced mess. But still, we made this work. And every single one of those red lines, plus probably dozens more that aren't on this slide, was an interface that required a fair amount of maintenance and a lot of expense. So by the 2000s, and at CHOC, they made the decision in 2000 to go to an integrated EMR. Now, with all that complexity of that best-of-breed systems, I think most organizations, bigger organizations by that time, were beginning to make a move to one of these new integrated systems. In our case, we went to a Cerner Millennium system. Epic was gaining a lot of traction at the same time, and Meditech was kind of expanding as well as others. But by 2010, I would say just about all the major organizations now, I would probably guess, are on more of an integrated system. The complexity of these systems has dramatically expanded. And if you look at a diagram, there's a database that sits in the center, and there's an application layer all calling that specific database. We still have a lot of interfaces where it says other applications. When you stand up a surgery department, you might have 8 other applications that all have to be interfaced back into your Cerner or whatever database. So it's not quite that simple. It's still a fairly complex world, but it's better with this integrated approach. Now, there are several databases behind the EMR. And those databases have different topologies. Some are transactional, or 2 main kinds are more of a transactional focus, like you'd find in an Epic or a Meditech system. They have a very fast transaction time, but they may not be the easiest to mine data out of because they're not set up to have you report data. They're often associated with a separate data warehouse that extracts the data into a data warehouse that's more of a relational warehouse that's easier to use on analytics. You can take the other approach and have a relational database at your core of your EMR. It's a lot easier to access data, but it may be, with all the computationally intense tasks that have to occur, you may have slower transaction times. Now, what is common to all these systems is the fact that we have a ton of discrete data within a structured database. Just to mention, though, we also have a terrific amount of data that isn't in structure, that's in the physician's notes, so, and other notes in the chart. So it's not all structured. But if you just look at the structured database, we have huge amounts of this so-called little data, and this creates a big data problem moving forward. So this is a deliberate lesson in leadership, where you've got to make an agenda for the meeting, so he's just going to freestyle it with jargon. And sometimes I feel like we kind of do these days with big data. Let's do a deep dive in the big data, drill down until we hyper-localize some disruptive technologies. Okay, that's enough leadership. Now the rest of you need to do something. But that's kind of, at times I think we kind of do that with big data a little too often, using it more as a buzzword than actually knowing what we're talking about. Well, let's talk a little bit about one practical or actual use of big data meeting the EMR. And that as we move forward in our environment today, where value-based reimbursement is really going to be what's going to be how we're going to be paid, so-called fee for value as opposed to fee for service, payment will emphasize provider or health system's ability to improve health, not just treat disease. Now, our EMRs are in no way suited for necessarily improving health to a population. They're more suited to taking care of the patient who presents in front of you, often with a disease that you need to treat. So we have to be a lot better at managing populations of people, not just patients who present to us for their care. And the data systems to support population health management also can't just accept data from our EMR. They have to accept data from lots of different sources, payer sources, laboratories, outside laboratories, lots of other external sites, because a person exists in a community and the community is not within the walls of our organization. So therefore, we need a real legitimate big data platform. There's a huge variety, volume, and velocity of data that's coming into that platform, and we're going to need that kind of platform to support population health. This gives you a little bit of the structure we have in our reporting environment. We have a lot of traditional databases that off of our Cerner database, but probably the thing to focus on more is off to the right and to the top, where we crawl data out of that Cerner database into a population health platform. And into that platform comes a number of other data sources. This is the vendor's diagram of their system. The things on the left are basically a Hadoop front end, and the things on the right where programs and solutions run is an HP Vertica platform. This is all cloud-based. In other words, I don't know where it is and interact with it. It's certainly not in our data center. So on the left, there's lots of these sources of data that come in as raw data sources, and then a lot of work has to be done in this Hadoop platform to basically create a population record. You have to figure out, match one patient from one system to the same patient in another system. So there's an MPI function. You have to standardize, normalize against, do the data quality work, the mapping to standards and others to create that population record. And then on top of that, run programs which give us population analytics, our registries for disease management, to care management, and others. So one thing I just wanted to mention down on those others, we're doing kind of a fun project that we just kicked off for down there where it says programs. And now that you have all this data in a big data platform, we're going to start using that data to help manage patients through looking at it, doing some data science on it, doing some predictive analytics, choosing, for example, we're going to focus on an asthma population, and we're going to look to see if we can identify those at highest risk and insert into workflows, alerts, and other things to help manage those patients. So that's kind of, will begin to show what a real data science approach to this big data is going to be able to provide. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Kevin, who's going to do the next part.
Thank you, Dr. Feaster. It's a real privilege to get to speak to you today for a few minutes about blockchains and healthcare. Thank you. We need to reinvent healthcare to be preventative. When we look at the current state of diagnosis, we take a point measurement, particularly if someone's symptomatic, and compare that against some clinical study, often from a long time ago, on a representative population, quote unquote. And if it's outside that threshold, some decision is made, and that's ultimately what sensitivity and specificity are based on. But I would argue that a representative population is really a flawed idea, and it's certainly in conflict to what the precision medicine initiatives are trying to push today. Beyond that, we know that genomics is important, but we all know that identical twins have differences in phenotype. And more data is encoded into our physiologic states than simple genomics. I think this is a sign that there's, as we all know, a huge amount of data coming our way. This used to be health data. It wasn't digital. It wasn't easily accessible. We moved on to the first generation of electronic health records. Digital, yes, but I would think most of us would agree are not accessible as far as the patient's concerned. On top of that, we have this unanswered question of what we're going to do with the huge amount of personal health data that's coming from personal health devices from everyone. This is something that I don't think anyone has answered well. We need to decide if it should be incorporated into any kind of EHR, if it's valid, what it means. And the promise of digital data is more than this. It's greater than the isolated medical records on some hard disk. The promise is really accessibility and interoperability. And our data should work for us. Our data should work for our patients. And no preventable disease should lead to death. In an ideal world, patients' records should be consistent and available across institutional boundaries. Access should be strictly determined by the owner, the patient himself or herself. And when shared, all patients should be able to understand the data with the goal of increasing the quality of the healthcare we provide. So when we take this lens and look at today, can the patient readily access their data at will? Can it be used effectively inside of a broader context for them? And is there a single source of truth for this data? When we look at some of the things we use today, certainly electronic health records are accessible, interoperable, and canonical in any kind of local sense. But the moment that you start to bridge these across multiple institutions, that starts to fall apart. And I don't think any of us would make an attempt to explain that the patient owns that data. I know when I make a request to my hospital for data, I need to go to the hospital records, and then sooner or later I get a PDF back or a DVD or something. USB drives we sometimes give to our more involved patients so that they might have some data when they travel to provide some information to hospitals should they need that. Whether or not those USB drives are interoperable, I don't know, but they're certainly not canonical. And the moment those USB drives are pulled off the hospital network, you've now bifurcated your truth. There's now multiple copies of data, and they will change independently. A number of independent companies have come out trying to build independent data clouds where they collate and congregate the data from your multiple health records into a single source. Their success will obviously depend on the implementation of that. But at the end, I don't think you could also argue that the patient still owns the data. You're shuttling the data from one place to another. That brings us to the problem of trust. In the old world, trust was ensured by in-person transactions, but our digital transactions today don't have that. And so we've set up authentication via trusted third parties. These are the banks, these are the EHRs. That brings us to blockchains. Many of you may have heard of blockchains in part because of Bitcoin, which is an encrypted currency. But they have a broader appeal to a number of fields. Blockchains are shared, distributed, immutable ledgers for transactional data that establishes accountability and transparency. And I think the best way to understand distributed is to look at what is not distributed. So the first graph there on the left is an example of a centralized communication network. Clearly, I think when that hub goes down, it should be immediately obvious to us that the entire network goes down. That, to some extent, still occurs in decentralized communications, where clearly there are multiple hubs there, and large parts of the network can become unavailable. in comparison to that, a distributed system is one where I think if you imagine any one of those node hubs going down, that the others are still available, that there's no primary importance put on any one over the others. This is from a paper from Paul Baran back in 1964. So blockchains are distributed transaction ledgers. They're composed of these so-called blocks, which are time-similar collections of transactions. So say every 3 minutes, any lab value that comes in gets embedded, any paperwork or any kind of note also gets embedded. These blocks are immutable and their integrity is verified because the block data itself is cryptographically hashed, which means that if any data inside that block changes, the hash no longer agrees. And it goes beyond that because the integrity of the chain is guaranteed because the hash of any new block is based on the cryptographic hash of the past. So changing some kind of data inside the blockchain 40 blocks ago is dependent on you also changing the consensus in the network across the 40 after that, which is obviously mostly infeasible. This is an image of a blockchain and a number of blocks. The blue squares being the actual blocks with the hashes back to prior blocks, and those orange circles are the transactions being placed inside each of the blocks. So blockchains don't depend on any trusted third party, like a bank or hospital EHR, and instead a blockchain is distributed to all nodes which participate equally in the network. Because there's no central authority, because no central authority validates the blockchain, a network consensus needs to be reached. And this is actually a very subtle thing that we'll touch upon briefly, but one of the more complicated issues. Blockchains improve accessibility. They promise to free our data from any single data silos. In an environment of tailored personal health data, blockchains create single canonical data sets dependent on time but independent of third parties. And with single longitudinal time series of very personal data, we can reduce personal false positives. So my hemoglobin may vary from what any kind of representative population does, but to me, over time, it means an entirely different thing and it may be normal. Blockchains improve interoperability. Patients are seen at multiple locations. They expect that. In their points of view, their records are a sequential series of events irrespective of where they occur. And furthermore, computation can be built into these blockchains so that later events can be based on prior ones. A bad pulmonary function test, for instance, may lead on to someone being prescribed an inhaler, and the prescription of the inhaler is dependent on that test. We improve trust with blockchains. First, the data is cryptographically secure. Much like in banks, the owner of the data, hopefully the patient, is able to award access to that appropriately and as needed. But it's more because, as we mentioned, blockchains are immutable, and later blocks depend on the accuracy of those prior to them. This data is distributed and in sync, and so there's not any single point of failure when discussing data truth. Finally, data consensus. This is something that's very interesting. The Bitcoin world has done this by developing something called proof of work, which is designed to ensure that the network reaches a 51% consensus. And then all the remainder of the nodes, because it's in their benefit to actually have the canonical data, quickly spread that data as the truth. That doesn't quite work with health data, and there's been a lot of people trying to figure out what that means for if this were used for health data. One group of writers discussed proof of interoperability, which basically means that the system needs to prove that this data is understandable within the confines of the medical standards. The work inside health blockchains, in some cases, are distributed evenly amongst the nodes. So in summary, we've not yet achieved the value, really, of digital data. There's currently no single canonical data ledger. There's cases where there's bifurcation of truth in the data, and data is hidden from owners inside EHRs. Owners don't effectively own their own data. Data owners are also not the arbiters of data access, and blockchains may go a long way in answering some of these problems. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Very excited and humbled to be here with all of you today. Before I deep dive into a subject that I'm very passionate about, cybersecurity and patient medical information, I just wanted to share a story that's very personal to me. So many years back, I remember the moment vividly when my wife came up to me and said, Pabrai, you're going to be a father. And I was obviously very excited at that moment, as many of you may recollect in your own journey of life. And I speak at conferences all over the world, and I was thinking, what should be something special when I hold that baby in my arms at that first moment of his or her life. And finally, that moment came. I was in Chicago at the Good Samaritan Hospital. Dr. Arora, a good friend of mine, came up to me and said, Pabrai, here's the baby, hold the baby in your arms. Now, I'd been practicing every day very hard on that script, and I had it memorized. I was prepared for that moment. I held the baby in my arms, looked into his eyes, and blanked out. I couldn't for the life of me remember a single word that I'd been practicing for 9 months. And the only words that came out were, Arshiyan, I'm your papa, and I'm an expert on cybersecurity. He started crying. So as I look into all your eyes, I hope that's not the experience we share. In the next 500 seconds, I will be with you on this topic of cybersecurity. So, 30 years, I was born in India, and for most of my career, I was a poor professional in this field of information security. No one really gave a damn about information security, and especially, as many of you know, in healthcare. Healthcare is way behind other industries when it comes to protecting and securing medical information, and God help us with a tsunami of information coming at us in the years to come. So to put things into perspective, cybersecurity, even if you open today's Wall Street Journal with the Russian, Trump, and hacking and all of that information, the 4 countries at least that we've got to be concerned about, and this brings back memory of the book that Thomas Friedman had written, The World is Flat. If he were to rewrite it, it's flatter, it's smaller. Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, these are countries that cannot be underestimated in terms of their cyber attack, cyber assault capabilities. As a matter of fact, I was recently speaking at a conference in Dubai in the Middle East, and the entire focus of the attendees in that conference in Dubai was on the cyber attack capabilities from Iran. So it is very significant. We share the same concerns right here in the US. And very simple techniques can be used to compromise very large databases. We've heard about EHR systems and the back-end databases with terabytes of information. That data, for the most part, if you go back and talk to IT and the security experts inside the organization, in 2016 today is bottom line not encrypted. And that data is at significant risk. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, this is published once a year, very credible report. It kind of gives you a feel for where information security is at this point of time. And just a couple of things I brought up. It's a very large report, about 100 pages, but 4 key facts here. 93% of cases took attackers minutes to compromise systems, and these are typically not discovered until weeks or months later. An IBM report that just came out last week basically states that it takes an organization, and get this, 210 days, this is today, 210 days to even discover that they've had a breach, that they've had an incident. We are not discovering breaches on a timely basis, and even after we discover it, we are not very competent in terms of how do we address that breach. And the numbers are about 70 days, 70, to address that breach or incident. And it takes attackers only minutes to compromise the system. So that's obviously the state of kind of where things are today as we look at 2017, 2018, and the years beyond with the increase in information. And the new technologies, especially, and this is the big one, the Internet of Things, and I just authored a paper, the Internet of Things, IoT, equals the Internet of Threats. So if you go back and think about the incident that a lot of publicity around that in the media and all of that on October 21 at 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern, when there were a tsunami of attacks that took place, leveraging the computing capabilities of these Internet of Things to compromise targeted attacks on domain name systems across the Internet, especially DIN. So that's kind of where things are today in terms of the attack surfaces has increased. That's the bottom line. And what's scary to me personally is that we, to a large extent, forget security literacy, we have security illiteracy inside most of our healthcare organizations. So challenges are not insignificant. 90% of web application attacks, they stole data, were financially motivated. Unfortunately, most of us, and we've heard about EHR systems, Cerner, Meditech, a lot of different vendors, McKesson and all of that, we in general are doing a very poor job of conducting penetration testing of those mission-critical applications. We generally don't know what the vulnerabilities are across those applications. So that's kind of a matter of concern. So that's kind of where things are. HIPAA, many of you are familiar with this regulation, since 1996. But 2016 is the first year where we've seen more fines with respect to HIPAA non-compliance than we've seen in the 20 years that HIPAA has been around. And this number is going to exponentially increase in 2017 and 2018. And in general, every time I think of protected health information, patient medical records and all of that, from a security perspective, there are two things to keep in mind. What are the compliance regulations that we have to meet? HIPAA is one of them. There are many other compliance regulations. And what are the threats in terms of cyber attacks and all of that? Compliance is the floor when it comes to information security, right? And most organizations today are not even credibly HIPAA compliant on a continual basis. So these fines are only going to increase, as my prediction, 2017, 2018. It's a 7-figure risk. And what comes in with HIPAA fines is that there's typically a 2 to 3 year corrective action plan where a senior executive has to attest that they're meeting the requirements associated with the deficiencies that were discovered. So this is all public information on the wall of shame at hhs.gov. Another thing that we've got to be concerned about, so HIPAA fines to me represents, in terms of risk to the healthcare organization, kind of the tip of the iceberg. More importantly, from a business and an executive perspective, we've also got to be concerned about class action lawsuits tied into data breaches. That's a big one. And the settlement that just occurred with St. Joseph Health, 8 figures, 25 million, plus the HIPAA fine on top of that, kind of gives you a story of where things will be in 2017, 2018. We are going to see many, many instances similar to St. Joseph Health in 2017, 2018, unfortunately. Our attackers, the individuals, organizations, and countries that are attacking us, and security experts understand this acronym, APT, right? Advanced Persistent Threats, right? Resources are not an issue for them, and they follow a very disciplined, very methodical, and in fact, are very patient. So this is one slide. This actually comes out of NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that describes a process that's used by attackers across the world to compromise systems and assets. There's always an initial reconnaissance, initial compromise. So just today, we ran a phishing attack on a county. There are about 3,000 counties in America. This county retained our services to take a look at their readiness in terms of cybersecurity. We ran a phishing attack, sent a simple email out. 33% of the users clicked on that link. And that kind of tells you where things are. That link then deposits a malware, and now that's the initial compromise that takes place. They establish a foothold, and then the dream of every hacker and attacker is to escalate their privileges so they can then compromise the keys to the kingdom in terms of the database servers, Active Directory, and you name it. And then internal reconnaissance takes place, moving laterally across systems, moving patient medical data out, because healthcare is so rich in general in terms of identity information and so poor in general in protecting, defending that information. And most of the time, we don't even know our systems have been compromised. But that's the life cycle approach. That's kind of what we are faced with as we prepare for 2017. The 3 pillars of information security, all security experts agree: confidentiality, integrity, availability. We've put more focus on the principle of confidentiality, which is where the HIPAA privacy rule is focused. Integrity, if there's any unauthorized modification. But we also got to be very concerned about ransomware type attacks continuing in 2017 and beyond. And that's where the principle of availability becomes very important, that generally healthcare organizations have not done a very good job of having credible data backups, contingency planning, IT disaster recovery plans, and all of that. A question that we've all got to ask when we go back to our organizations is that if a system is compromised, if a system is hacked, Do we have the capabilities to recover the data, patient data, medical information, within 2 hours of that event occurring? And the short answer to that question for most organizations today is, unfortunately, we do not. And then 3 of the very important references in terms of cybersecurity as we look into 2017. ISO 27001, which is the only true global information security standard. Just in the last 60, 70 days, I've led teams to conduct cybersecurity audits in India, Philippines, Taiwan, and other places. And the language that they all speak in terms of information security is 27001. Very, very important to at least map your capabilities inside your organization in terms of your HIPAA compliance program to ISO 27001. PCI DSS and NIST are other very credible works in this space. I understand I'm running out of time. I'll skip a couple of slides here. So as I bring my presentation to a close, I think there's a lot of opportunity for healthcare organizations to first continually comply with the HIPAA regulation. HIPAA implies HIPAA privacy, HIPAA security, high-tech breach notification, as well as here in the state of California, we've got a multitude of California privacy and security regulations that we have to comply with, and to really ensure that we've got a credible compliance and cybersecurity program that's based on evidence. Thank you so much.
All right. Good morning. My name is Nick Vanta Hayden. I'm the Chief Medical Officer with NTT Data, formerly with Dell Services. So when we get to my slides, you'll see that there's a little bit of confusion in terms of the contact points. If you can't find me, there's a problem with the internet, I would suggest. At nights and weekends, I double for Gordon Ramsay on Hell's Kitchen. You get it now, right? You think about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data sources, build on some of the principles that we've heard. One of the things that I face as a clinician on a day-to-day basis is the increasing numbers of data points that I'm asked to process as part of that decision-making activity. And when I qualified, there was maybe 10 pieces of data that we processed. We've been on this exponential scale that has added all of this additional information into the healthcare setting that is really challenging the people that are in the system. And we've heard a number of presentations earlier on that talk about some of the technologies that I think will help in terms of mitigating this, not replacing the clinician, replacing the decision-making, but supporting it in ways that allows us to bring that knowledge and information to the point of care. The other thing that you heard a little bit about in one of the previous presentations was this additional data that's coming. That was a coin that was touted, the quantified self. I was one of those individuals that did buy Google Glass. Anybody looking for a pair, I'm willing to sell, potentially. I have an AliveCor device there, that's the EKG device, but I was really only trotting after this guy, Chris Dancy, who has an extraordinary number of data capture devices, and that's his Google Calendar. Those are all his data points that he captures on a daily basis, and you can look at that and say that's extreme, but I think we're moving towards that, as you've heard, in terms of those single-point decision-making. And from a potential, I'll give you one insight that he created or discovered as part of this data acquisition. He realized that when he watched a series, episode 1 followed by episode 2 of Breaking Bad, he descended into poor health behavior. So instead of good quality health, he would go and get the chips and dips. So instead of watching Breaking Bad 1 and 2, he'd watch Breaking Bad 1 and then go to another series. That change alone allowed him to lose 40 pounds in weight. Just that one insight. I think there's probably at least one person in this room that maybe will change their data binging or TV binging habits based on that. Wasn't just that, but that was enough. So this is all the data that we're starting to add. I think we're never going to be ultimately offline. I know I feel like I'm never offline.
I know my wife thinks I'm never offline, just to be clear. And that's good and bad, but we have to incorporate that into the decision-making and the clinical process. But as we look at that data, we have to put it in the context. And again, we heard a little bit about this in the earlier presentations. It's not just the number of steps. It's steps in the context of a congestive heart failure patient who maybe can only walk 50 steps, so getting to 60 is a huge increase for them. And putting that in the context of all of that information that we have today, I think, is essential. And we already know some of these wearable manufacturers are already seeing insights that they can predict injury in people before it occurs. So about 3 weeks before you get an ankle injury, your wearable device is giving signals that suggest you're going to injure yourself. We're going to have to start to tease out that data and include it. And whilst I recognize the challenge of data validity and the pushback from clinicians, I would suggest that it's never a data problem. It's always a filter problem. And we have to filter that data correctly to present it to give useful and actionable insights. We can then take that to a global level from a populational health standpoint that says, let's look at patients, look at their markers with a simple green, amber, red that says, I've got a problem here, and then drive that down to the individual patient level when they're in front of me. So that context needs to be appropriate for what I'm doing, my job, my role. In this case, dealing with the right patient, the right time, and the right point of care to give those insights that offer utility to that patient and to me, assembling all of that information appropriately. And then we have genomes and sequencing and all of that data that's being delivered in. This is the statutory slide that seems to be presented pretty much in most of the genome conferences. I haven't seen it today, so I get to present it first, and now everybody else has to adjust their presentations to remove it. But that's the exponential decline in cost. We're below 1,000. I've been sequenced. I'm sort of exploring this. We've still got problems, but that presents this data challenge. And if you think about the target of sequencing just the cancer patients alone, we have 5.6 exabytes of data that's going to add into the data record, and the issues of securing and actually bringing that to utility. And whilst that's a challenge, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because as we look at the proteomics and all of the other additional systems that we're contributing and able to capture that data, that's going to increase our knowledge and our understanding and really change the way that we approach healthcare and medicine. This is an exciting time, but this is an overwhelming problem. And obviously, I come at this from a data standpoint, and the ability to secure, serve that up is going to be critical, and I think it's going to be a specialized function that you're not going to be able to achieve in your institutions, but will have to revert out to specialists to be able to do that. And that gene data offers as insights and changes the rules. So in the same way that we saw Silicon Valley and the innovation of computers and people in their garages, we've got the same thing going on with genomics. So we've almost reached that $1 million gene expression data set that's publicly available, accessible. We've got kids as their science projects doing gene sequencing, ordering up the models and going through this process. We're changing the capacity to understand, learn, and develop new insights from that data as we free it and extend the availability of that information into different groups. I happened to watch the movie about the mathematician and his insights into maths from around World War I. And that one individual, coming from a background with almost no formal education, his insights we're still using to understand black holes today. I think we're going to see the same kind of thing happening with all of this data with genomics. And we've seen one. This is just one simple example. If you've seen sudden cardiac death, I just heard of a friend, her niece died from this, 22 years old. It's very hard to determine with basic testing. Gene sequencing, we've got expression, we've got indicators. It's imperfect, but it moves to this individualized capacity that says, I can do this at any location. I can do it with plug-in devices that will plug into your cell phone. We're starting to develop insights that are really changing the way that we look at patients. And this is one other example. And in this audience, some of you are going to think about this. I know I did when I had my full sequencing. But this testing showed that 99% of the population tested had an actionable pharmacogenetic variant just based on a limited number of tests, so 6 tests, and they showed 99% actionable. So pretty much most of you will have some actionable insight in your pharmacogenetics. It's no longer the tried and tested, test this drug, see if it works, if it doesn't, move on to another. So ultimately, we're moving to this data deluge, and the terminology has changed from that kilo, mega, all the way down to zettabytes. And that will change the scientific method. I know this is a little bit radical to suggest that it will be obsolete. I think it must change. Our groups of patients will be much more individualized. We might have a group of 5 patients that we look at. We might find correlation initially and then move to causation. But that's really going to revolutionize our space and the research and the application of all of this knowledge and science. And we're forecasting this massive increase. For me, this represents the sort of key aspects of learning. Biometric data is on an exponential rate. Data management and the use of that is going to be critical for everybody's capabilities in this space. And that traditional scientific method is going to fade and disappear. We keep developing new insights just based on the insights that we have. And that data security risk expands as the edge explodes. And I wanted to pick up a visual for those of you. If you're wondering about your healthcare data, that's what you look like to the hackers. You've got a target on your back. Sorry, AI Med, but that's how I perceive that. It's a huge target, and we have to secure it, and you heard some of the opportunities and the technology that's going to help us. And we're going to utilize all of this information. It's going to revolutionize our space. It's a really exciting time, and I'm so excited to be here at this time right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and that was an amazing talk as well. Hello, everybody. My name is Ash Dhamle. Let's see. Yes, I'm going to present his slide, so we'll go ahead and begin. My name is Ash Dhamle. I'm the CEO and founder of Lumiata, and sort of as a personal background, I'm a data scientist from MIT. And really, you know, today's morning discussion was absolutely fantastic and extraordinarily interesting when we're talking about data, the possibilities of it. And really what my hope here today is to talk a little bit about sort of what we've done to sort of address some of the data challenges that we've sort of talked about today, the deluge today that we're getting as was just described. The fascinating thing was we sort of noticed about 7 years ago that the amount of data we're finally now generating and capturing is simply exploding. And as you know, was just clearly articulated, how is it that we actually make sense of this data? But as this morning was very clear, there are actually lots of challenges with respect to health data. The first is, as we talked about in this morning, was the fact that there's actually, you know, the health data is not actually clean. It's actually pretty dirty, lots of incomplete and missing data, it's fuzzy, right? Second of all, it's actually sparse and fragmented. So as we go to multiple different institutions, what we find is the fact that the data is not combined in a longitudinal record, right? We talked about some ways to solve that with blockchain and others, but fundamentally what happens is each person or each person providing care actually only gets part of the information about an individual, right? And secondly, the fact that in healthcare, perhaps compared to almost every other industry, perhaps is the most complex set of data because of the high dimensionality. If you think about the number of labs, the procedures, the medications, the trends, the temporal aspects, the possible combinations, you literally are talking about potentially millions of different variables that you're trying to understand about an individual. So one of the things that through our sort of work is come to truly appreciate the extraordinary job that physicians do every day dealing with a complexity that is at times almost, you know, incomprehensible. And so what my hope here today is to talk about some of the work that we've done over at Lumiata to somewhat address this complexity. How is it that we can combine the knowledge that we've generated so far by human beings with the, you know, extraordinary capabilities of machines? So how do we get man plus machine together to really sort of address some of these issues? And really to sort of do that is combining data science and medicine. So in a very general sense, what we do at Lumiata is our goal is to provide perfect risk awareness. How can we predict the health of an individual today and how that health is going to evolve over the next 2 years? And fundamentally then what we can do about it. And to sort of do that, what we've built is a medical graph combining with the deep learning and probabilistic graphical models based on data mining all of PubMed, so all about the 50 million articles. Combining that with sort of about 60 million patient records, looking at that temporally, with about 40,000 physician hours. So this is really, how do we really start combining some of the questions of priming the deep learning with knowledge that we already have today, right? So how can we express information that we get from articles and journals, things that we know, hypertension is indeed a risk factor for chronic kidney disease. How can we prime deep learning in those senses with that types of information and knowledge? And a lot of our focus is, it's great that we're generating all this data, but one of the key things we need to understand and learn is how do things actually relate to each other? It's not as if day 2 of being hypertensive, you have a 1.2 odds ratio of chronic kidney disease. It sort of grows over a span of 10 years in sort of an S-shaped curve, right? So what we're really trying to understand from the clinical, the non-clinical, as also was talked about this morning, the social aspects, you know, someone's living home alone and lonely, that has large amounts of impacts, both psychologically and subsequently clinically. How do we actually understand how all these things actually relate to each other so that we can create very precise models at the individual level? Because that's what we're really trying to do, right? We're not trying to treat populations. It's important for us to be able to manage to that level, as was sort of articulated earlier as well. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide the best outcomes for each person. And so by really understanding how things actually connect to each other, we can actually address many of the problems. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that we went from ICD-9 to ICD-10. We have obviously LOINC codes, CPTs, NDCs, RX norms. We can go into the N number of different coding systems that there happen to be. But how is it we actually combine that information together? If you actually look at serum creatinine, for example, there's about 15 different ways that you're going to actually have that coded as a LOINC. So unless you actually understand how actually the different codes can be aggregated, that they understand they're all measured in the same analyte, how is it you're actually going to stop the issue that your data, signal is being fractionated, right? And so by really looking at how these things connect and understanding that and leveraging data to learn how those things are. We talked also this morning about how papers and how potential relationships, how can we go ahead and get, in effect, papers to suggest through NLP, potential relationships, and how can we leverage data in now larger amounts that we're able to have than before to really start proving that out and actually seeing, is something truly a risk factor? Is something truly a complication or not? And that's really where the medical graph really comes into play. And really it's about how do we take these types of systems, these types of data, now represented in a different way through a medical graph, and allow us to start predicting, because that's what we're really trying to do, right? If you think about medicine, medicine is inherently predictive. It's trying to understand where the person's health is today and how that's evolving. How can we create systems to help us surface the signal from the noise, from all the different data that we're generating, right? We talked about the security of aspects, but once we address those things, it has to be put to work, as was sort of articulated earlier in the earlier panel. And really sort of our focus is to do so, but not being able to explain it without that interpretability, that also causes a problem. And so a large part of our focus is how do we combine all these new techniques in AI to actually start driving why something is. So not only are you trying to predict or understand the clinical state of someone today, but trying to understand the causation and also the potential correlations, but really be able to articulate that. So we get a clear, logical, audit trail that we as human beings can engage with and actually interact with. And so one of the things I've spoken today was to really say how with graphical representations, how combining with the deep learning, it provides a sort of a technology foundation to really sort of do the complex analysis that we want to do so in real time, right? It's in that moment, in that 100 milliseconds as that new piece of information comes, how do we combine that with everything else that we've had to date to surface the signal that actually is meaningful for us to comprehend and therefore can engage and interact with people. Right? And it's really about how do we combine and come up with a representation where we can combine the work that us as human beings have done with the work that we can learn from leveraging AI into a standardized representation. That's really where your data science and your medical science really start coming together. And that's really where graphs and as well as deep learning really come into play. So just want to talk about sort of as that option or idea of how we think about how we represent data, not only how we store it, not only how we secure it, but how we represent our data and how we represent our knowledge is infinitely important to how we can actually apply that at scale in real time to data, right? So it's an issue of we have to look at throughout the entire chain of not only that data creation, the data veracity, the data security, but also as that passes through the data interpretation so that we can actually prioritize who we need to engage with to really enable the resources that we have as human beings to be applied in the most effective way possible and to really allow us to deal with the potentially 6 million data points in 15 minutes, right? And so that's really where when we start looking at these new ways and new things of doing things, we're starting to get the technology foundations we need to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, we have a question and answer session that's going to be between you and lunch, but we have 15 minutes that we're going to be responding. I have several interesting questions here that the audience has put forward. Actually, the first one is relevant to the conference. I'm going to direct this at Ali. Why haven't we leveraged artificial intelligence to detect security breaches in real time? We have these 7-month or whatever periods of time until they're discovered. Why couldn't we have bots or something inside of our systems searching this out and detecting it immediately?
I think that's a very good question. It's very logical. One of the biggest challenges in healthcare for a long time has been that senior leadership, executives, board of directors have not treated security as a priority. Even I would go as far as to say HIPAA compliance has not been a priority. So when there's no funding, when there's no budget, when you look at the IT department inside the 6,000 plus hospitals in the country, you generally find a very significant lack of information security skills and expertise. We have IT people being asked to do security things. That's like asking a doctor in internal medicine to be a cardiologist. There's a difference. And so I think that's been a challenge. The only thing that's getting the attention of senior leadership are these breaches and the penalties that are coming their way. And now finally, I think in the last year or 18 months, we're beginning to see more funding being provided for information security than we've seen before. So we've got a long ways to go, but funding has been a big issue.
Just to sort of jump in, I think you're going to start seeing some of that now, but it's actually not a healthcare problem just by itself. The fundamental idea of leveraging AI to really improve security and looking at continuous network monitoring, identify anomalies, identify possibilities, do across multiple different channels, that is starting to happen. And I think you'll start seeing companies, both startups as well as very mature companies in the security space really starting to come out and leverage many of these techniques towards that exact end. And I think in a lot of that, then you're going to start seeing that applied to healthcare as obviously an important set of data to secure properly.
Okay. There were quite a few questions about using data from EMR systems for research and the barriers to it, which kind of gets into the ability to to transfer data, which works into blockchain. There's several questions about blockchains. I think sort of echoing one of those recent comments, if an IT department doesn't have the resources to really protect their data properly, they tend to go inward and not just sort of refuse to allow any data out. If you can't protect it, if you don't have the people who know how to do that, if you don't have the ways of transferring data securely, you just keep it behind your firewall. And that I think a lot of people trying to do research on data are finding that they may have an IT department that is really hunkered down and they won't let anything out because they're afraid of what's going to happen to it because they don't really have terribly good controls over it. Our department's a little different in that we do have a chief information security officer. We do have a fairly aggressive program to leverage our data for analytics and working with our Innovation Institute, but we're probably a little bit of an exception out there. Nick, you look like you have a comment.
So I think that's a misnomer that securing it behind the firewall or whatever is actually going to secure the data. I'm sure my colleagues would agree with that. And my sense of this HIPAA regulation is that it's used very much as an excuse to prevent access. What you heard was a very eloquent description of the blockchain and the capacity and the ownership of data. And whilst there remains discussion, there is a big view that patients own their data, and it's my data, and I can secure it with blockchain. I can provide access, and I can rescind access dynamically through that model. And most patients would give up their data as long as it's not used against them. I think that's the underlying principle. And if we can provide the infrastructure to support that, that would essentially help the research community to garner the maximum value from all of this information. I think we all want to contribute, but we don't want to be used or have that data used against us.
I think that the will of people to keep the data inside single EHRs, I think, goes back very significantly. The field of data security is much younger than the field of personal security. And we grew up for a long time thinking that we were safe inside our walled cities and so forth. And I think the way to think about it is, if you have thousands and tens of thousands of EHRs out there, I'd argue that there's a fairly standard distribution of security practices, meaning that the vast majority of them are below the best practices. And so the case, I think, can be made that why don't you get the best people in security in the world to handle the security for all of the systems? But it's a very real human emotion that we want to keep our data, our checkbook inside our house, our personal health data inside a single EHR.
Just as another point, I think there's a lot of work right now on how people can create sort of anonymized data sets that still have meaning, right? We want the longitudinous, you need to understand the things from that perspective, but how do we actually ensure anonymity and therefore really be able to open up data sets? And I know there's actually quite a bit of work going on to provide people the tools required so that they can take their data and provide sort of these anonymized sets, which therefore allow people to do the research that we all care and want to actually happen, but do so in a way in a much more secure and comfortable fashion.
Yeah, maybe we can move for a second to blockchain, and there are several questions about blockchain. One of them was, for blockchain, does all data exist at each node? And what do you also mean by consensus in this context? And also, can blockchains scale to big EHRs?
I think that the question of does all data exist at every node is a very important one. And before I address that, I think we should point out that the capabilities of storing large data and transmitting it are obviously increasing. That said, I think one could make a much easier case that moving around people's encrypted heart rate data is a lot easier than their CT data. Some people have solved this by proposing so-called data lakes, where a lot of this data would sit and that the blockchain would contain more meta information. And that's certainly one way to approach that. The case has to be said that you are defeating, in some sense, the purpose of the distributed data, but there are clear limitations at the moment about the size of data that needs to be conveyed. And the next question?
Is it transferable to, is it scaled to big EHRs?
Very much so. I mean, the EHRs are based on various forms of local databases, and I think this is turning that idea on its head in the sense that the data, and you would structure the data in some sense independent of the blockchain, but the data itself exists outside of that EHR. It's widely distributed, and so in that sense, I think it's a sort of a reimagining and perhaps inversion of some of those concerns. And in terms of, what was the last one?
The data at each node.
Yes. Yeah. But these are, you know, no one knows the answers to these questions. And the thing to happen next is for people to build out proof of concepts and see what works. And that really needs to happen. And then we'll discover. The great thing about this is that no one really knows yet.
Okay, there are some comments about HIPAA and how it stifles research through the protection of data, but also on the other side, worries that will all this work open people up to scrutiny, or if their data is out there, will they be more susceptible to insurance companies and insurability in terms of rates, et cetera? Any comments on that?
So worth talking about the insurance. So the regulations today state very clearly that your genomic data cannot be used against you medically. But there is a gap in that it can be used from an insurance standpoint. So your insurance rates could go up as a result of having genomic data that implies that you're less healthy or going to have a shorter life as a result of that. And you know, it goes back to my point about not having that data used against you ultimately. I think that's really the key in this, but the regulations haven't caught up. And yet we see a number of projects. We see it in the UK. The NHS is trying to assemble about 100 million gene data sets from the population. And whilst I respect the issue of anonymization, that seems a little bit impossible to me, given that our gene sequencing is used currently in the criminal courts to assign guilt. And if I have your full genome, I don't know how you anonymize. I'm just struggling with that concept of anonymization, and I think some of it requires regulatory catch-up.
Yeah, there was someone asked a question of Nick.
So I'm going to try and repeat it, John, if I can. So as of today, your data is being used. If you gave up your genomic data anonymously, the life insurance companies, long-term care are already legally using your data against you under the current regulations. Great point.
Okay, back to security. We have just a couple more minutes. If we follow standards rigorously, such as ISO 27001, aren't we becoming predictable to the hackers? In other words, could we be a little more creative to avoid hacking into our systems?
That's a very good question. These standards that are out there establish the minimal capabilities that organizations should be implementing. It's the floor, not the ceiling. And unfortunately, because typically in healthcare organizations, we are not being very disciplined about the way we conduct cybersecurity risk assessments on a regular basis. So what these standards do is they bring some rigor and consistency and discipline in your security program. Your program today generally, and your organization is more of an exception, but programs generally today are very reactive and they're not proactive. And even when you look at the HIPAA regulation, HIPAA is not about military-grade security. Everything in HIPAA comes down to 3 words: reasonable and appropriate. You define what is reasonable and appropriate for your organization, but no organization can define what's reasonable and appropriate without conducting a very comprehensive and thorough risk assessment, and most healthcare organizations do a very poor job of that.
Okay. Kevin, I'm going to refer you to the question up there. I thought you know, healthcare does have its 3-letter and 4-letter acronyms, but as you go into this business, you're going to see a lot of other acronyms. I'll let you take on that one.
The POW, that's a privacy, that means something to do with privacy, I assume? Proof of work. You know, and is your question focused on the proprietary nature of it? I confess I haven't thought too much about this. I think that when it comes to proprietary issues embedded in chips, I think that, you know, if you look at the Linux crowd, they seem to be constantly lighting themselves on fire because of concerns about proprietary technologies, and I think with some good reason. But my hope is that in many cases, as has been in the past, that these things that start out proprietary, once they become more common, start to open up to open standards. I think that there's clear interest in a lot of the commercial organizations to having proprietary advantages, and hopefully when everyone starts to get to the same spot, those things become less proprietary. But I don't know about I haven't thought about the proof of work thing, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, well, 48.76 seconds. Let's go ahead and thank you very much to our panel. And it's been a good discussion, and we'll move on to Anthony and lunch.
Thank you. Wonderful morning. Almost need a little break to just absorb some of the things. Some of you have raised questions about the Q&A. They're all going to be archived and given to in a document form, so you have it on the website. No worries there. Because some of the speakers are giving us sort of last-minute changes on your slides, we'll have the slides up as soon as we can. The abstracts will also be loaded during the meeting, so the abstracts and the presentations. And lastly, if you're really just dying to read things during lunch, put together a 70-page synopsis and glossary for you to look over. So that's plenty of material, I think, for lunch. And it is about relaxation also. I'm a firm believer, I'm a cardiologist, I believe in a diastolic or relaxation period during a day. So there's diastole coming up. The lunch is going to be outside. We'll see you at 2 o'clock. Just remember that we modified the schedule a little bit this afternoon so that we'll have, so don't look at the schedule on the back of your identification cards. It's modified slightly so that you can enjoy the nice sunset at 4:44. So we'll break between 4:30 and 5 before the last important session when all the speakers come up and answer all your questions, and have a few interesting polls for you, as well as a few James Bond trivia questions to give away prizes, okay? So we'll see you at 2 o'clock. Have a nice lunch.
Do you believe in what you say? There doesn't seem to be